This video is about how scientists might have found a way to separate bipolar depression from major depression, two things that share a lot of similarities.
Editor Kit here. Need to clarify that I meant objective way, that scientists might have found an objective way to separate the two different kinds of depression.
Heads up, this video is going to get nerdy. Very nerdy. As the content in this video is the intersection of two of my favorite things, mental health and biomarkers. So sit back, grab a beverage, and let's get into it. This is gonna be so much fun. To start, there's a big problem in the mental health community when it comes to diagnosing bipolar disorder. Up to 40% of those with bipolar disorder are initially misdiagnosed with unipolar depression, or what we know as major depression. And there are a few key reasons for this. Oftentimes people with bipolar won't seek help when they're manic or hypomanic, but they will seek help when they're depressed. And adding to that, oftentimes when someone is manic or hypomanic, they don't realize they're in mania or hypomania. So of course they'll go to the doctor when the depression hits, not when the mania has them thinking they're just in a really good mood. And if a doctor doesn't think to screen for mania, something again the patient likely does not realize they have, then those patients can be misdiagnosed with unipolar depression and given an antidepressant. Which doesn't sound like a problem initially until you realize that for many people with bipolar disorder, SSRIs and other antidepressants can trigger manic episodes that can absolutely ruin your entire life. So separating bipolar depression from unipolar depression early on is vital. And scientists might have developed an objective test to make that separation. And the study is looking at something called a biomarker, which is a fancy term for an objective measurement that can be used to help identify and diagnose a certain disease or condition. When you start dealing with something like mental health, which is largely diagnosed based off subjectivity rather than objectivity, well, biomarkers start to sound like a good idea. An objective way to know for sure if someone has a mental illness or not? That sounds very attractive. And while psychiatric evaluations are highly effective, they take time to get. So an objective test like this one is much quicker, hence their value. And using the two kinds of tests together, well, they'd almost be unstoppable. So in October of 2023, some scientists at Cambridge University published a paper titled Metabolomic Biomarker Signatures for Bipolar and Unipolar Depression. And if that sounds a teeny bit complicated, that's because it kind of is. I friggin' hate paper titles, you guys. But anyways, in simpler terms, it's basically, hey, we're trying to find tiny things in people's blood that help us differentiate between bipolar and unipolar depression. And these little things are called metabolites, which is just a fancy term for extremely small molecules. Common metabolites are sugars and alcohols. And metabolites themselves are the end result of many processes in your body. When you take a medication, for example, it gets broken down or metabolized into a bunch of tiny pieces, aka metabolites. Metabolism is everywhere, metabolites are how it's studied, and the field of all of it is called metabolomics. Now it's time to talk about the study. After recruitment and a few different qualifying rounds, 241 people in active depression who had been diagnosed with major depressive disorder in the last 5 years were chosen to be a part of the study. One of the qualifying rounds was filling out an extensive mental health questionnaire of over 600 questions, and the results from that questionnaire placed people in either a bipolar or unipolar depression category. And yes, some of these people had no idea that they had bipolar disorder, but that's the point, to help diagnose it with an objective test that's used alongside an effective questionnaire. So of course they're going to identify people that have bipolar because misdiagnosis is that common. Now the next step, obtaining samples from those people. Another one of the qualifying rounds I mentioned earlier was obtaining something called a dried blood spot sample, which they would then use to check for metabolites. And dried blood spot samples are an easy way to get a blood sample without having to visit a doctor's office. You literally prick a finger, get a few drops, put it on some filter paper, and then mail it off to the lab. Super easy and hard to mess up. And now that we have the samples, we reach the next part, scientific experimentation and analysis. This is the portion of the study where they're going to look at those really tiny particles I mentioned earlier. Remember metabolites? Well, in order to know what metabolites are in a sample, they need to be detected. And one of the most well-known ways to do this is by using an instrument called a mass spectrometer. This is because oftentimes scientists don't know exactly what's in a sample, so they need to discover it, even if they know what they're looking for. And you don't have to know everything about a mass spectrometer to know its importance. You just need to know 3 things. 1, it breaks the sample into lots of pieces. 2, it accelerates those pieces and they bend around a curve according to their weight. And 3, a detector identifies those weights, and now that we know this information, we can determine what's in the sample. Basically, using a mass spectrometer is an expensive way to find out what's in something, whether it be plasma, blood, or tissues. And it does this by simply weighing the metabolites in the sample in the big, fancy $1,000,000 machine. And it's through discovering what metabolites are in a sample that paves the way for biomarkers to be found. And that's exactly what they're doing here. And now that we're done with mass spectrometers and other sciencey stuff, let's talk results. What they discovered were 17 biomarker candidates out of the 630 metabolites they were looking for in the samples. Those metabolites, those biomarker candidates, correlated with lifetime manic symptoms. Which is so interesting to me because the presence of mania and hypomania is what separates someone with bipolar depression from someone with unipolar depression. And the most relevant class of compounds for those biomarkers was a group called ceramides, and there are lots and lots of them. You might know ceramides for being in your skin or in popular skincare products, but they're actually found elsewhere in the body too. They're abundant in the central nervous system, meaning the brain and the spinal cord. And they're precursors to these things called sphingolipids, which make up parts of cell membranes. They keep the barrier between the inside of a cell and the outside world flexible and able to move, which is really important in the brain. And speaking of brain, ceramides do play a role in neurotransmitter communication. And we all know neurotransmitters are believed to heavily contribute to psychiatric disorders. Starting to see why ceramides make sense as biomarkers when it comes to this kind of mental illness? Yeah, me too. And it makes me wonder, does ceramide metabolism have anything to do with the causes and symptoms of bipolar disorder? Questions like that are why science keeps moving forward, and I'm not the only one asking them. At the end of this, 28% of that final group of 241 people were diagnosed with bipolar disorder because of the study. And they did this by following up with these patients at 6 and 12-month intervals. So it wasn't a one and done thing, they followed these people for a year. Meaning this whole thing was actually effective and scientifically sound. For now, the scientists have filed a patent for their methods. So hopefully one day soon, there will be a test out there that can accurately identify unipolar and bipolar depression so that everyone can get the right treatment the first time. I hope this helped you understand a little bit more about where we are in the scientific world when it comes to biomarkers and mental illness. Originally, the DSM-5 was meant to have biomarkers for every major mental illness written within its pages. And that was over a decade ago. But after this video, I'm sure you can see why that's kind of a massive undertaking. However, this study is a good step in that direction. And I'm sure there are other studies in the works that are pushing towards that outcome. Some that I'm sure I've already missed. If you want to fact check me or do your own research, I have linked to the paper that I talked about in this video in the description box down below, along with some press articles that are also associated with it. I've also included a paper that talks about ceramides and their relationship to different mental illnesses, so if you want to dive a little bit deeper in that direction, that paper's a good place to start. And I found it pretty cool as it's somewhat related to this study. Anyways, that's all for this video. If you'd like this, let me know in the comment section down below. It was a deeper dive than what I normally do, so I'd love to get some feedback. And if you want more nerdy things, check out this playlist of all my nerdy videos. But other than that, thanks for joining me and making the uncomfortable comfortable. I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.